Thomas Annan was a Scottish photographer. The photographs he took of Glasgow in the second half of the 19th century are invaluable in giving us a look at how Glasgow was way back then, at a time when a lot of the city was being torn apart in order to improve living conditions for the working classes. This video is about just one of his photographs. It probably dates to the late 1860s and towards the 1870s. It was titled Clothes Market, Foot of Saltmarket. Annan's main subject matter, we have to presume, was the clothes market right at the very corner of Glasgow Green, but the photo also gives us a really good look at Greendyke Street, which ran along a part of the edge of Glasgow Green, a street that today looks very, very different to how it looked back then. And I think that is probably what this video is about.
So, there's Greendyke Street in a Google satellite view. It runs from the Saltmarket along the edge of Glasgow Green, curving into London Road by the Barras. Apart from the old church on the corner of Turnbull Street and the adjacent red sandstone building, most of the street is modern, housing mainly, with a bit of vacant land by the curve near London Road. If we then fade to John MacArthur's plan of Glasgow dating to 1778, you can instantly see that Greendyke Street didn't exist back then, although it is tempting to think it was in the early stages of development, because if you look, there does appear to be a tree-lined avenue by the squiggly line of the Camlachie Burn. We can see the low green part of Glasgow Green, which at that date was made up of the Low Green, High Green, New Green and Gallowgate Green. In fact, in this engraving dating probably to the 18th century, we can see the various greens of Glasgow Green with soldiers drilling on the Gallowgate Green, just north or on the right of the Camlachie Burn. Returning to the 1778 map, we can see that the Camlachie Burn merged with the Mullendiner Burn just west of that familiar old church before flowing into the River Clyde. In addition to that old church, called an English chapel on the map, we also see an area of ground called Merkdaly Yard, which is roughly where Charlotte Street and that vacant land is today. The word Merkdaly apparently means a daily market where fruit and vegetables were sold. Charlotte Street itself was only created a year later in 1779. If we then fade to Peter Fleming's map of 1807, we see a bit more going on. That old church is still there, this time called the Episcopal Chapel, along with the tan works, no doubt making good use of the waters of the Camlachie Burn. The old fruit and veg market has gone, and big houses now line the newly created Charlotte Street, one of which, close to the Greendyke Street corner, was the property of David Dale, that eminent philanthropist who created the cotton mill mecca of New Lanark. We can also see that tree-lined avenue on the banks of the Camlachie Burn more clearly, an avenue that would come to mark the course of Greendyke Street. We can perhaps start to get a flavour of the developing street in this image dating to 1829. On the right is a high wall protecting Mr. Dale's property at the end of Charlotte Street, and there's the old church peeking above it in the background. That's the still standing court and jail building on the Saltmarket way in the distance, while in Glasgow Green women are drying lines of clothes and bedding. There's also a guy leading a couple of cows along Greendyke Street. The good old days. If we then jump forward in time from 1807 to an 1857 order in Survey Town Plan, Well, the detail is astonishing. Don't worry if you can't make out the wording on all those new buildings. We'll zoom in shortly and get a better look. Probably one of the most interesting developments is the appearance of the Esplanade on the corner of Saltmarket and Greendyke Street. And this is where I bring in Annan's photo. We're looking down on that Esplanade at the corner of Glasgow Green, and we can clearly see a good bit of Greendyke Street. My intention now is to try to marry up the buildings in the photo with what we have on the 1857 town plan, so as to identify what exactly these buildings were used for. Zooming in on the 1857 town plan, we can see no detail for the buildings sitting west of Turnbull Street, then called Low Green Street. But if we look at Greendyke Street itself in this area, we see a number of things going on. In addition to many folk in and around the clothes market in Glasgow Green itself, there are some folk standing at wheeled barrows, women by the looks of them. These barrows, or barras, could be hired and wheeled to a location where you would sell your wares in the street, which is kinda how the nearby Barras Market developed. In this photo, dating to around 1916, we see a woman selling books from a barrow in Greendyke Street, with that old church in the background. Annan's photo also shows a building with a sign on the frontage. The Glasgow Hide, Skin and Tallow Market Cooperative Society. A bit of a mouthful, but clearly a business. Moving east along Greendyke Street in our 1857 map, we see that old church, seats for 700, and a whole load of interesting stuff. Parry's Music Hall, a storehouse for rags, a timber yard, sawmills, model lodging house, St Andrew's Baths and Washing House, and St Andrew's School. But can we pinpoint all this stuff in Annan's photo? Well, there's the old church, and on its right is Parry's Music Hall, sporting a pretty bland frontage for such a place of entertainment. Parry's Music Hall was built in 1849 and initially called the Queen's Theatre. George Parry took the reins in the 1850s, but apparently ran something of a dive that was crowded with the most abandoned of youth. Help me, Bob. Among the various forms of entertainment, they may have sung songs of the period with riveting titles like Jock, Man, Who's Your Tory? And Dick's Among the Gutter. That looks very much like the entrance to the timber yard, with the model lodging house on the right, a rather low building if I've got this right. In a later 1890s map, Parry's has gone, and a new hide, wool and tallow market has appeared to replace it and a few of the other enterprises. This rather attractive red brick and sandstone building was constructed in 1890 and still stands today. Moving further east along Greendyke Street in Annan's photo, we find a building we can easily identify, which allows us to slot most other buildings into place. It's the three-arched frontage of the old clothes market. Opened in 1875 and so not shown on the 1857 map, this took the place of the Corporation Market in the corner of Glasgow Green. We can see it more clearly in these photos dating to around 1910 and 1916. But sadly, this rather lovely building was demolished just a few years later in 1922. The trade in old clothes then moved to Jail Square, then Shipbank Lane, where, known as Paddy's Market, it ended its days. Before the old clothes market was built in Greendyke Street, the site was occupied by the St Andrew's Baths and Washing House, as shown on the 1857 map. In an age when most working-class housing in the area had no indoor toilet and no indoor running water, often with just a sink on an external landing, this must have been a well-used facility. Annan's photo lets us see a little further east before things become a tad indistinct. To the right of the old clothes market we have a gap, then a rather grand two-storey building. This was once St Andrew's School. It's clearly shown on the 1857 map and has an identical footprint in the later 1890s map, although it looks like it's no longer a school by this date. The taller building on its right has a pub at ground level. We can in fact see the old school and a bit of the pub in this photo dating to 1909, when the school building was occupied by James Bowl and Company, rag merchants. You can see the word wines on the pub on the far right. If we look again at Annan's photo, there's no doubt that it's the same building. On the other side of what would become Lanark Street, Annan's photo reveals a rather curious stepped frontage. In the 1890s map, this was a drill hall, or headquarters of the 9th Battalion Highland Light Infantry, who we probably saw earlier drilling on Gallowgate Green, later renamed Carlton Green. In the 1857 map, the site is just a grand back garden attached to the Glasgow Iron Firmery, which became known as simply the Eye Dispensary in our 1890s map, a place where one presumes they dispensed eyes. David Dale had moved out in 1827, and his grand house was later demolished in the 1950s. Beyond Charlotte Street, we can't see much in Annan's photo, but we still have maps. As well as the big houses on Charlotte Street and a few timber yards and a school, there's not a great deal of info in the 1857 map. But the later 1890s map reveals a vinegar, sauce and pickle works, as well as a pub at the Monteith Row corner. We can also see the McLennan Arch on one of its merry jaunts about the city. Indeed, this old postcard shows the arch and that very pub. More recent Ordnance Survey maps dating to the second half of the 20th century tell us that the vinegar, sauce and pickle works eventually became a coffee works, a business that took over additional premises on Greendyke Street, where the old clothes market and rag merchants used to be, and it was indeed here that the world-famous Camp Coffee was made, as first created in 1876 by Campbell Patterson in Glasgow.
Often when carrying out research for these videos, it very gradually becomes clear that the video that I'm making is not the video that I thought I was making, because some other subject has slowly crept in there and is becoming more dominant than the subject I thought I was covering. I thought this video was about Annan's photograph in Greendyke Street, and in many ways it still is. But it's also about Glasgow's clothing industry, an industry that ended its days in Shootbank Lane, where it was known as Paddy's Market, in 2009. I mean, I remember decades ago, probably the 1990s, when Paddy's Market was open, you would often see an occasional old woman sitting on the pavement in the Briggate, and in front of her would be a pile of clothes just lying on the ground. Not folded or anything, it was just a pile of second-hand clothes where people could rummage through them and pick something that they thought they could wear. It's a heck of a way to earn a few extra bob, or to perhaps even survive. I'm Eddie Burns. Take care.